They said I was mad. I say I was inconvenient. That is the quarrel between their story and mine, and it is why I write by a tallow candle in a cabin not meant for any human soul. My hands, once tender enough to wince at a needle, are rough now, split, salted, and honest. I set them on this page, so you may see what they named sickness, and what I call sight. If the letters waver, forgive the fire that lives in my fingers after a day among burrs. If the breath comes shallow, blame the smoke. Yet I have never been steadier. 2 years ago I had a mother's Bible, a Charleston address, and a sister whose smile turned locks without keys. I had education and the vanity that mistakes a quick mind for a safe life. Then debt came like fever, and grief like winter. The townhouse thinned room by room until even mother's pearls were translated into coins that bought only time. Beaumont Plantation took me in April of 1857, white as a bone pulled from heat. Catherine stood on the veranda in blue silk that would never know dust. "Eleanor," she said, always Eleanor, as if the name might press me back into an obedient child. She promised quiet, and for 3 days I lived it. A clean bed, roses cut into squares, figures copied into ledgers that pretended people were not their greatest entry. But forgetting is not my gift. My mind has seasons that ignore the calendar. There are bright days when the world arrives too sharp, and the truth crowds like uninvited guests. Society prefers its ladies softened, their thoughts poured thin and sweet. When I could not be thinned, they called it illness. Call a river wicked for running fast. It will not slow. Do not mistake me. I have sinned against prudence. I have laughed when silence was mercy, and spoken when quiet would have spared blood. Yet even my errors taught me to tell one chain from another. Some are iron and bite the skin. Others are sewn from soft words, for your own good, for the family, for Christian, charity, and they bite deeper for being gentle. If this account begins in a parlor with teacups and laughter like glass, you will think it a tale of one wild afternoon. It is not. It begins here, where I sit, in a room the law calls property. It begins with songs that travel the night like a river under the floor. I did not know their words, only their weight. I pressed my palm to the boards and felt the rhythm move into my bones. For the first time since my mother's last breath, I was not alone. Understand the arithmetic. The big house counts in acres, bales, and guests. The quarters count in steps before dawn and cups of meal. I learned this from my palms, not a book. Cotton is a white lie, soft to the eye, cruel to the touch. The first burr draws blood, the next teach and preach until you say amen. Later, a girl would tell me, quick and light. That first week I had no guide but pride, and pride is a heavy skirt. Night after night the songs returned, and with them a clarity that felt like both cure and wound. I saw that Catherine's smile was a veil and her pity a form of fear. She prized a life arranged like her gardens, trimmed, bounded, polite. I was a wild stem. She would press me into shape or clip me to the root. The quarters tutor the timid. Hunger is a stern master, humiliation a sharper knife than any overseer wears. It cuts away illusion. In that cutting I discovered a vow I had not known I carried. If they hid me among the enslaved to spare a reputation, then the hiding would be their undoing. If they called me mad, I would use the mask they handed me. I would walk where a proper lady could not, and be forgiven for it. Tonight the house is quiet the way a snake is quiet before it strikes. Mercy's step passes slow and sure. Patience's is quick and careful. Grace hums before she speaks. They are not my blood, and yet I trust them more than any portrait in the gilded hall. I trust their silence more than prayers said over silver. You think me bitter? Perhaps. But bitterness is rooted. It drinks what the soil gives. Mine grew in earth, watered by denial and shaded by careful phrases. The Beaumonts prefer the soft whip of language to the noisy one of leather. The latter leaves welts. The former leaves none you can see, and still teaches you to knot your own gag. I told you at the start that I would make the mistress pay. Do not expect screaming. Justice, I have learned, is not a drum but a needle small, tireless, drawing the same thread through the same wound until the seam holds or the cloth fails. I will not strike Catherine. I will hold up a mirror until the light she hates finds her face. I will keep books by moon, teach letters under a blanket, and turn their numbers into knives. I will learn the hours' doors go unlatched and the names stamped on papers they trust. Mad, they say. Let them. Madness is a cloak as useful as mourning if you know how to wear it. When the bright season takes me, I will wander and be pitied. When the clear season follows, I will stitch what I learned into a plan. If I laugh in a parlor again, It will be because the truth is too heavy for a quiet voice. There is a bell that wakes the quarters before the Sunday. Soon it will ring. Before it does, I pray not as the mistress prays, with lists and bargains, but like a woman asking a river to remember her name. I pray for a mouth that opens and shuts at the right times, for hands that bleed only when the purchase is worth the price, for sight that will not be cured into blindness. They said I was mad. I say I am awake. If wakefulness is a crime, let the candle burn to the nub and the night take what is owed. Tomorrow they will count our baskets. I will count debts and doors. We are ready. Tomorrow they will tally bodies. I will tally names, roots and kindness, and stitch them into a map no whip can tear at dawn. The morning I arrived at Beaumont still breathes in me like a fever. The carriage wheels groaned over gravel as though each turn carried a warning I refused to hear. I pressed my mother's Bible to my chest so hard that worn leather left an imprint across my ribs. It was the last thing she touched before she died, my inheritance, my compass, my proof that I had once belonged to a world where comfort felt eternal. By the time I reached South Carolina's low country, that world had shriveled like parchment in flame. Through the window, I watched the plantation rise from the haze, white columns glaring against the sun, draped in moss that looked like mourning veils. The air was thick enough to drink. Somewhere beyond the oaks came the rhythm of song, deep voices marking the tempo of toil. Those songs carried something both unbearable and holy, and though I could not yet decipher the words, I felt them inside my ribs like the echo of my own pulse. I should have known then that the songs were not background music to Southern prosperity. They were the truth beneath every shining surface. When the carriage stopped, the driver, an older black man with kind eyes and the quiet posture of endurance, extended a hand to help me down. "Careful, miss," he said softly. The gravel stung through my thin-soled shoes. I smelled the fields before I saw them. Sun, sweat, and something raw, the scent of human effort pressed into soil. My eyes burned from the heat, or maybe from shame, though I could not have told you for which sin. And then there was Catherine. My sister stood framed by the veranda, the picture of Southern virtue and success. Her pale blue gown shimmered like calm water, her ringlets were arranged with the precision of habit, and the smile she offered me was the kind practiced in mirrors, perfect from every angle but hollow as a shell. "Eleanor," she said, using the name society found easiest to swallow. "How good to see you, dear sister." I tried to return her grace. "Thank you for taking me in." The words were smaller than I intended, as though my voice understood before I did that this was not rescue, but exile wrapped in silk. Catherine's eyes flickered blue and cold as porcelain glaze. "You are family," she replied, though I heard the strain in the tone that cracks beneath politeness. "This is your home now." Her home, I realized, was built on more than wood and stone. It was built on silence. Inside, the house gleamed with imported marble, portraits, and crystal light. Every surface reflected wealth. Every scent from beeswax to roses carried a trace of ownership. The air itself seemed disciplined. I felt my own reflection fade in its mirrors, a smudge among perfection. My room faced the gardens. From the window, I saw Catherine's ordered roses and the fields beyond them, endless white under the Sunday beauty and bondage, separated only by hedges. That night, I unpacked what little I owned: 5 dresses, a comb, a locket, the Bible, and told myself that perhaps I could still be of use. I wrote in the account books. I drafted letters. I kept to the quiet rhythms Catherine prized. For 3 days, she almost looked at me without flinching, but I could sense her fear growing. It lived in her posture, in the way she watched my hands when they trembled, or my gaze when it wandered too far into thought. Madness to her was not a sickness of the mind. It was an imperfection of the facade. She needed me cured into invisibility. I was a reminder that blood could betray its breeding, that chaos could share a face with grace. Those early mornings I roamed the veranda while the mist still clung to the fields. The slaves were already at work, bent silhouettes moving in slow rhythm through cotton that shone silver in dawn's half-light. I remember thinking how strange it was that suffering could look so peaceful from a distance. I had been raised to call it industry. Now, the sound of the whip cracked that word into pieces. One afternoon I helped Catherine with household accounts. The ledger lay open on her lap, the ink neat and black, the handwriting so elegant it almost disguised the horror it recorded. Provisions, tools, losses. Then, beneath the columns of numbers, Negro woman, patience, breeding age, strong. My breath caught. Catherine glanced up and smiled as if she'd caught me admiring the penmanship. "It's simply business, Eleanor," she said gently, "the way one speaks to a child." You must learn not to dwell on unpleasant realities. Unpleasant realities. That phrase would haunt me. It was how polite society embalmed its sins with ribbons of refinement and lavender water. Madness, I thought, was not in seeing too much. Madness was in pretending you saw nothing at all. On the third night, a storm rolled across the rice fields. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant turned every drop of rain to silver fire. The house shuddered. Catherine clutched her pearls and murmured a prayer. I stood by the window, watching the slaves run to cover the cotton with tarps, their bodies black lightning against the glare. Thunder swallowed their shouts, but even through the glass I could feel the urgency, the fight not against nature, but against punishment. In that flash, I saw my future. I did not yet know its name, but I sensed its direction, downward, toward the quarters, toward the people who labored through storms I had only ever watched. The next morning, I asked Catherine if I might help with the correspondence again. Her reply was a smile too bright to be kind. Rest, dear, you've done enough. Her eyes lingered a fraction too long. That was when I knew she had been thinking, planning, calculating how to contain me. Fear had written itself into her face, but it was not fear of me, it was fear of reflection. I was her mirror, cracked and inconvenient. That night, as the lamps dimmed, I heard faint music from beyond the fields, a chorus rising against the dark. No instruments, only human voices, woven together like threads of smoke. It sounded like mourning and defiance at once. I leaned out the window to listen, the rain still dripping from the eaves, and whispered words my mother had once taught me. The truth will set you free. I didn't yet know whose freedom I was praying for, mine or theirs. When dawn returned, the storm had passed but left the air bruised and heavy. Catherine summoned me to breakfast dressed in her finest, though no guests were expected. Her smile was perfect again, but her voice trembled just enough to warn me that the calm was prelude. Eleanor, she said, we're to have company tomorrow. Some ladies from Charleston, Mrs. Thornton, and the Caldwells. I should like you to join us, I agreed, unaware that this gathering of tea and lace would end whatever fragile peace remained between us. That evening, I sat alone in my room and tried to pray, but the words tangled. My thoughts wandered back to the driver's kind eyes, to the songs in the fields, to the realization that the walls of this house were not protection, they were disguise. Somewhere beneath its marble floor lay the truth of what it cost to appear civilized. In the garden below, Catherine's roses gleamed red against the white pillars. They were beautiful, yes, but I noticed now how their roots ran deep into soil rich with rot. Perhaps all beauty here was fed by decay. I closed the Bible and whispered to the shadows, if they send me into madness, let it be a madness that sees. I did not know the price those words would exact. The next afternoon, the guests would come with their gossip and perfume, and my laughter would shatter their composure. But on that final night of calm, I felt a strange peace. For the first time in my life, I understood the edge between sanity and truth, and I was ready to cross it. It began with tea. Always tea, the weapon of polite women. The afternoon sun burned through the tall parlor windows, catching in the porcelain and lace, painting everything too bright, too fragile. The air smelled of roses and sugar, but beneath it, I could sense the iron, the discipline that kept this world from unraveling. Catherine had arranged everything perfectly. She had chosen my grey muslin dress herself, modest enough to calm the whispers, simple enough to erase any trace of Charleston elegance that might remind her guests I had once been something other than a charity case. Smile, she whispered as the carriages approached. And for God's sake, say little. The Beaumont parlor looked like a shrine to refinement. French furniture, wallpaper with golden vines, every detail imported and exact. It was also a stage, and I was the prop that refused to stay in character. The first to arrive was Mrs. Thornton, all starch and certainty, followed by Mrs. Caldwell and Mrs. Ashford, faces powdered, voices like tiny bells, soft, high, and merciless. They greeted Catherine as though entering a chapel and greeted me as though shaking hands with an echo. My poor dear, Mrs. Caldwell said, her gloved hand fluttering near mine but never touching. Such a tragedy, your widowhood. Charleston must feel so empty without you. I nodded, playing my part. Catherine's invented story, widowed, grieving, delicate, was meant to make me pitiable but safe. The truth was far more dangerous. I wasn't grieving a husband. I was grieving my place in a world that required lies to survive. They spoke of weather, of ribbons, of God, and I tried to keep still. The china clicked like teeth. My tea was too sweet, my gloves too tight. A pressure built behind my eyes, a familiar gathering storm that no one else could hear. It began as a tremor in my hands, then a tightening in my throat, and finally a ripple of laughter that escaped before I could swallow it. At first it was small, a polite laugh, almost forgivable. But then Mrs. Ashford smiled and said, "Such lovely weather for a garden party. The roses are splendid this year, Catherine." Something broke. The laugh tore out of me like a wild bird escaping a cage. It filled the parlor, loud and wrong, bouncing off the mirrors and china until it became something unholy. The women froze, cups suspended mid-air. Catherine's fan stopped moving. "Eleanor," she said softly. The warning threaded through her voice like a needle through silk. But I couldn't stop. "Yes," I gasped between peals of laughter. Perfect weather for roses watered with sweat and blood. Perfect weather for pretending the world smells like sugar when it reeks of suffering. The room went still. My laughter became words. Sharp, unstoppable. "Do you hear them?" I asked. "The songs outside the window? Those voices carry the weight of every luxury in this room. The tea in your cup, the silk in your gowns, the sugar on your tongues, every sweetness here is bought with pain. Can't you taste it?" Mrs. Thornton's eyes hardened to blue glass. "My dear girl," she said, voice clipped, "you are unwell." "Yes," I said, the laughter twisting into tears. "Unwell with truth. Unwell with seeing." The silence after that was a living thing. Catherine's knuckles whitened on the armrest of her chair. Mrs. Caldwell coughed delicately, the sound of retreat. Mrs. Ashford reached for her shawl as though modesty might protect her from contagion. Catherine rose. "My sister has not been herself since our mother's passing," she said, calm as a priest at a funeral. "Grief sometimes manifests in peculiar ways." "Peculiar?" I whispered. "Call it by its name, Catherine. Call it guilt." Mrs. Thornton stood, her mouth pinched in righteous disgust. "I have seen this before," she said coldly. "The affliction runs in families. And there it was, the death sentence of reputation. The word madness hung between us like smoke." Catherine's composure cracked just slightly, enough for me to see the terror underneath. "That's enough," she hissed. "Sit down, Eleanor." But I didn't. Sit down? After we've built thrones from bones? After we've made virtue from cruelty? I looked at each of them in turn. "You sip your tea while children are sold like livestock. You debate weather while men die in fields outside your gardens. You call me mad, but you are the ones who sleep through the screams." The cup fell from my hand and shattered on the marble. The sound broke the spell. Mrs. Thornton gasped. Catherine moved so quickly her chair tipped behind her. "Eleanor!" The name hit me like a slap. I realized too late that my moment of revelation had condemned me completely. The women gathered their shawls and gloves like armor. Mrs. Caldwell murmured, "Poor thing," but her eyes said ruin. Mrs. Thornton's voice carried finality. "You must send her away, Catherine, for her sake and for yours." When they left, their perfumes lingered roses, powder, lilac, and underneath it all, the acrid scent of judgment. Catherine stood by the window, hands trembling as she closed the drapes. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I spoke the truth," I said quietly. She turned on me, her voice rising. "You humiliated me. You humiliated us. Every word you said will be repeated across Charleston before morning." "Perhaps it should be," I said. "Perhaps they should hear it." Her eyes filled with tears that were not sorrow but rage. "You think you're a martyr," she whispered. "You're a disease. You infect everything you touch." Behind her, Richard Beaumont entered, his boots heavy on the marble. His face was stone carved into disapproval. "Enough," he said. "We will not have hysterics in this house." Catherine swallowed, her voice trembling. "She's unwell, Richard. You can see that." He looked at me as though assessing a faulty piece of machinery. "Then she needs to be removed. For her safety and ours." Removed. That word clung to me like a curse. That night, I sat by my window, the same one where I had once watched the fields and prayed for peace. The moonlight fell across my hands and I saw they were shaking, not from madness, but from clarity. I had finally said aloud what everyone knew and no one dared confess, and for that, I would pay. Below, the cabins were dark, save for one faint lantern glow. I imagined the women inside, their bodies aching from the day's work, whispering stories to stay alive. I wondered what they would think if they knew there was a white woman upstairs whose own kind planned to bury her among them. I whispered to the darkness, "If they call me mad, let it be the madness of truth." In the silence that followed, a night bird called once, sharp and lonely. The house slept, but I could feel the turning something had shifted. The order Catherine worshipped had cracked, and through that crack, light had begun to bleed. By morning, They would decide what to do with me. But even then, before the dawn came, I understood. The laughter had freed me. It had cost me my name, my place, my safety, but it had also stripped away every illusion. Madness was not my curse. It was my awakening. The sentence was passed before sunrise. Catherine didn't summon me to her parlor this time. She sent a maid instead, a trembling girl who couldn't meet my eyes. "Miss says you to come," she mumbled, and the words sounded like a funeral toll. I followed her through the gleaming halls, my slippers whispering against marble that suddenly felt colder than stone should be. Catherine stood by the window, already dressed for breakfast in pale muslin and composure. The dawn light made her face look carved rather than alive. Richard sat behind her, reading a newspaper he wasn't actually reading. The silence between them was thick as fog. "You cannot remain in the house," Catherine said without turning. Her voice had the brittle calm of a blade held too long in ice. "Your presence here, it is untenable." The word hung in the air, clinical, bloodless and final. Not sister, not family, untenable. I stepped closer, the hem of my dress brushing the carpet. "And where would you have me go? Back to Charleston? To the asylum you threatened me with?" Her mouth tightened, but it was Richard who answered. "You'll go to the quarters," he said. "You'll work. You'll keep your head down. And you'll be silent." The quarters. It took a moment for the meaning to settle because my mind refused to hold it. "Among the slaves?" I whispered. Catherine's gaze flicked toward me then, quick as a whip strike. "You will live as they do for now, until we find a more suitable solution." I laughed, sharp and short. "A suitable solution," I repeated. "For madness or for embarrassment?" Her eyes glistened, but not with pity. "For both." When she left the room, I knew the woman who walked away was no longer my sister. She had shed her humanity as easily as she shed last season's gowns. The walk to the quarters was less than half a mile, yet it felt like crossing an ocean. The morning sun already burned against my neck, and the air grew heavier with every step. The path wound through a grove of pines that smelled of sap and damp earth, then opened onto a clearing where 12 small cabins crouched like old bones in the dust. Chickens scratched near the doorways. Children with solemn eyes watched me pass, their laughter dying into silence as they took in the sight of a white woman being led by another toward their world. Catherine didn't look back. Her parasol cast a perfect circle of shade over her golden hair, and even that detail enraged me, the sky itself conspiring to protect her from the heat that scalded the rest of us. "Patience!" she called, her tone sharp and practiced. "Come here." A woman stepped from the nearest cabin, tall and poised despite the roughness of her dress. Her skin gleamed like bronze in the sunlight, and her eyes, dark, steady, met mine for the briefest moment before flicking to the ground. "Yes, Miss Catherine," she said. "This is Eleanor," Catherine began, pausing as if the name itself were difficult to speak. "A poor white woman I've taken on to work in the fields. She'll be staying with you. See that she learns what she must." Patience's gaze swept over me, taking in the soft hands, the worn but still fine dress, the confusion that I couldn't disguise. Understanding dawned in her expression, quiet and deep. "Yes, Miss Catherine, we'll take care of her." Catherine nodded curtly. "And Eleanor," she turned just enough for me to see the warning in her eyes, "you will not speak of your former life to anyone, not one word. If you do, the consequences will be severe." I wanted to answer her with scorn, with fury, with anything that might make her tremble. But my voice failed me. I managed only a whisper. "I understand." She left me standing in the dust, skirts already stained with red clay, surrounded by people whose lives had been purchased, traded, and commanded by my family's kind. And then she was gone, a shimmer of blue silk retreating into the distance. Patience stepped forward, her voice gentler now. "Come on, miss. You best get inside before the overseer sees you standing idle." The cabin was one-room earth floor, rough plank walls, a faint smell of smoke and damp. Inside were 3 others. Mercy, her hands knotted with age. Grace, barely grown and already heavy with child, and a small boy who peered at me from the shadows, curious but cautious. "You can take that corner," Mercy said, nodding toward a patch of floor covered by a thin blanket. "Ain't much, but it's yours." I set my small trunk down and sank beside it. The air inside the cabin felt close, as if it remembered every breath ever taken within its walls. For the first time in my life, I had nowhere to sit but the ground. Patience ladled cornmeal mush into a wooden bowl and handed it to me. "Eat," she said simply. "You'll need strength come morning." The food was coarse, almost flavorless, but I swallowed every bite. Hunger makes humility easy. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds that filled the darkness, the creak of the roof in the wind, the murmur of prayers, the faint crying of Grace in her sleep. My own tears came silently, and I pressed my face into the blanket so no one would hear. At dawn, a bell rang across the plantation, one harsh note that ripped through dreams. The others rose immediately, moving with practiced rhythm. I stumbled after them into the early light, my stomach already knotted with fear. The cotton fields spread before us, endless white beneath a pink sky. The plants looked delicate from a distance, almost beautiful. Up close, their boles were cruel, ringed with tiny thorns that sliced skin like glass. Each worker carried a rough sack that dragged behind them through the rows. Patience handed one to me. "Fill it," she said, "and keep up if you can." By the second hour, my hands were bleeding. By the fourth, I could barely stand. The overseer Briggs, a man whose eyes carried no light, rode past on horseback, cracking his whip not from necessity but habit. Every lash in the air made my heart flinch, though I soon realized he seldom needed to strike. Fear did his work for him. When I fell, Mercy was the one who helped me up. She poured water from a gourd over my face, murmuring, "Little sips, child. Too fast, you'll make yourself sick." Her voice held neither judgment nor pity, only understanding born from long endurance. "Why help me?" I asked, ashamed of how small my voice sounded. "I don't deserve your kindness." Mercy shrugged. "You may be white, but your people threw you away same as ours did us. Trash is trash to the ones up high." Her words struck deeper than any whip could. She was right. I had been discarded by my own kind and claimed by suffering. I was no mistress here, only another broken body in the Sunday. That night, when the bell released us and the sky turned violet, I watched Grace hum to her unborn child, while Patience mended a torn shirt with needle and thread. Mercy crushed herbs into a paste and wrapped my hands. "It'll draw the fire out," she said. The smell was sharp, green, alive. I whispered, "Thank you." Patience looked up from her sewing. "Don't thank us yet," she said softly. "This life takes everything, even the thanks." Outside, crickets sang. Somewhere beyond the fields, a whip cracked once, then again, until the sound dissolved into silence. I thought of Catherine in her fine bed, dreaming of peace built upon this noise. In the dark, I began to understand the price of her calm and the shape of my own awakening. Time reshapes a soul more slowly than labor does a body. The first weeks in the quarters stripped away what pride had survived my exile. Dawn, heat, ache, dusk, each day rolled into the next until the hours lost their names. I began to measure time not in minutes, but in scars. The rhythm of plantation life replaced the rhythm of society. The bell was our clock, the sun our overseer. I woke before light most mornings, the air thick with dew and smoke from dying fires. The cabin was always full of breath, soft snores, murmured dreams, the faint cry of Grace turning in sleep. We took breakfast in silence, a handful of cornmeal mush, sometimes a scrap of salted pork if rations were kind. Then the bell, and the world moved as one body toward the fields. At first I tried to preserve something of my former self, straightening my spine, keeping my words precise, but the cotton stripped refinement, quicker than it stripped flesh. The plants clawed at my fingers until the skin split, until I learned the secret Patience had whispered, quick and light, like touching something sacred. Still, the sun punished without prejudice. By noon, sweat slicked my dress until it clung to me like shame. The overseer rode among us with his whip resting casually against his thigh, humming a hymn. He seemed most alive when others bent. Yet among that bending, something else grew connection. We spoke in glances at first, then in murmurs between rows. Mercy taught me to wrap cloth around my palms before the blisters opened. Grace shared the rhythm of her breath, how to pull cotton without tearing it. And Patience, who never wasted a word, told me stories not of her suffering, but of her endurance. At night, the quarters transformed. The fields were graves of silence by then, but the cabins glowed with whispers. I learned to recognize the sound of resilience, low voices carrying songs that were neither prayer nor rebellion, but somehow both. The first time I joined, my voice cracked, timid, wrong. Grace smiled through the firelight. "Ain't about pretty," she said. "It's about remembering we still got voices." And so I sang. I learned that Patience could read. She revealed it one night when the rain came down so hard it drowned the crickets. We huddled near the small fire, and she drew a scrap of newspaper from a hidden pocket. The edges were soft with age. From my last place, she said. Master's daughter taught me, told me never to let nobody know. Her finger traced the words carefully. Freedom, Congress, God. She said each one like tasting it. Can you teach me? I asked, though I already could read. It was my way of asking permission to share her secret. She studied me for a long moment. You already know them letters, she said finally, but maybe you can teach the rest of us. Real quiet. That night, the candle burned lower than usual as I wrote in the dirt with a stick, shaping letters while Grace whispered the sounds back to me like a hymn. Mercy laughed softly, shaking her head. Words, she said. They get folks killed. Then let them be worth dying for, I answered. We made a school of the shadows. Every night after work, when even the overseer's dog had stopped barking, we'd gather close and draw words in the dust. Hope, north, light, free. I told them the alphabet was a key, that the door it opened might not be visible yet, but it existed. They believed me. I needed them to believe, because faith, any faith, was the only rebellion left to us. Sometimes my mind betrayed me again. The fits came with no warning heat behind my eyes, laughter rising where silence should live. During one such spell, I nearly exposed everything. We were in the fields, the air so thick it shimmered, and suddenly I felt it again, that crushing sense of absurdity. We're all slaves, I shouted, my voice raw. Every last one of us, some in chains, some in manors. The world spun. Briggs galloped over, whip raised, fury in his eyes. Patience stepped between us, calm as still water. She's sick, she said quickly. The heat done took her. Her body blocked mine like a wall of mercy. I remember the smell of horse sweat, the gleam of the whip poised above her, and the sound of my own breath ragged with terror. But he didn't strike. Maybe he saw my pale skin, maybe he saw madness in my eyes. Either way, he spat on the ground and rode off. That night, my body trembled with shame. You could have been killed, I whispered to Patience. For me, she shrugged. Ain't the first time I stood between a fool and a whip. Won't be the last. Then her voice softened. You're starting to learn what they don't want you to know, that none of us safe. Not even them. Fear's what keeps the whole thing standing. Fear. That word lived in every corner of the plantation, in the crack of the whip, in the silence before an order, in the careful ways we looked at one another. But once you saw the machinery of it, you couldn't unsee it. And something in me began to shift. I no longer wished to return to the big house. I no longer prayed to be accepted. I wanted only to understand the truth fully and to wield it. I began sneaking out at night under the guise of my madness. If caught wandering, I'd mumble nonsense, eyes vacant, and they'd dismiss me as broken. It was the perfect disguise. I studied the plantation the way I once studied scripture, with reverence and precision. I learned the guards' rotations, the way the locks on the storehouse doors clicked when closed, the pattern of the dog's patrol. I watched who carried the ledgers, who held the keys, and who whispered after dark when they thought no one listened. I discovered that Richard's finances were crumbling. He owed more money than he owned, and creditors pressed him like vultures. Catherine pretended otherwise, keeping her posture straight while her world rotted. Even her pearls, once symbols of her power, now seemed to tighten around her throat like a noose. In the cabins, I told no one what I'd learned, not yet. Instead, I poured my discoveries into teaching. The lessons grew bolder. I began to explain maps, how rivers led north, which stars pointed freedom's way. Grace drew them in the dirt and named them like children: Polaris, Ohio, Hope. When she laughed, it sounded like a door opening. The night her baby kicked for the first time, we all felt it, a tiny drumbeat beneath her skin. She's strong, Mercy said proudly. Grace smiled, radiant in the firelight. She'll be born free, she whispered. And though we all knew the law said otherwise, none of us corrected her. For that one moment, belief was freedom enough. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of survival became second nature. My body toughened, my mind sharpened, my madness turned tool instead of curse. I had learned to bend without breaking, to listen more than I spoke, to trade my old arrogance for observation. But with knowledge came danger. I saw how close rebellion and ruin walked hand in hand. A wrong word, a glance too direct, a moment's hesitation before obeying, and the whip would fall. Still, the hunger in me grew. Hunger not just for food or comfort, but for justice, for a reckoning no prayer could postpone. One night, as rain drummed against the roof, Patience spoke quietly. You ever think maybe God sent you here for a reason? I looked at her, startled. You think God planned this? Not the pain, she said. The seeing. She turned her gaze toward the door, where the storm pressed like breath on wood. Some folks get born blind to the world. Some get born to see too much. Maybe he needed someone to walk between both, to tell what's hid. Her words sank into me like seeds. I lay awake long after others slept, listening to the rain's rhythm match my heartbeat. Maybe she was right. Maybe my exile wasn't punishment, it was preparation. By the time dawn came, the first hint of a plan had begun to form in my mind. I didn't know its shape yet, only that it would demand everything I had left, and that once it began, there would be no turning back. The day it all unraveled began like any other, too early, too hot, too loud. The bell clanged before sunrise, dragging us from our pallets into the pale grey that passes for morning on a plantation. The fields shimmered with dew, each cotton boll glinting like an eye watching us return to our chains. I had been working the rows long enough that my hands no longer bled openly, only scabbed and cracked in patterns I'd come to accept as my new handwriting. But that morning, something felt wrong before I could name it. The sky had a strange stillness, and the air carried a weight that pressed on my chest. Even the birds were quiet. I remember thinking it felt like the breath you take before thunder. By mid-morning, the heat was unbearable, the kind of heat that melts thought. The others worked in silence, moving with the rhythm of survival bend. Pluck, straighten, step. Briggs circled us from his horse, his whip resting across his knee like a promise. I kept my eyes down and my hands busy, but inside my head, the storm that Patience called my seeing fit began to gather. It always started with light, too much of it. The world grew sharp and bright until every shadow seemed alive, and every sound carried meaning. My thoughts started racing, and before I could contain them, they broke loose. "We're all slaves," I heard myself cry out. My voice didn't sound like mine, it came from deeper, rawer. The heads nearest to me jerked up, alarm flashing in their eyes. "All of us," I went on, louder now, the words pouring out like fever. "Some in chains, some in lies. At least yours are. Honest," Patience hissed. "Eleanor, hush." But I was already too far gone. Laughter spilled out of me high, desperate, uncontrollable. I spun in the red dirt, the sky spinning with me. Briggs wheeled his horse around, fury tightening his face. "What did you say?" he barked. His voice cut through the field like steel. The laughter wouldn't stop. "We're all mad," I shouted. "The world is mad. And you," I pointed at him, still laughing, "you're the worst of it. You think you own people. You think that makes you sane." He was off his horse in a blink, boots sinking into the soft earth, whip raised. I saw the glint of it above me, saw death coiled in that leather. Then Patience stepped between us. She moved fast, faster than I thought human weariness allowed. Her arms spread just enough to shield me without touching him. "She's sick," she said quickly, her voice calm, steady, trained. "The heat's got her bad. She don't know what she's saying. Ain't right in the head." Briggs's lip curled. "You calling me a fool, woman?" "No, sir," Patience said softly. "Just saying she needs shade, is all. I'll see to her." He hesitated, the whip still trembling in his grip. The air between us was alive with danger, the kind that could kill without warning. I stared at him through the haze, the world shimmering around the edges. Then, God help me, I spoke again. "No," I said hoarsely. "You will not touch her. I am Elellanena Whitmore, sister to Mrs. Catherine Beaumont, and I forbid you." The words leapt out before I could stop them. A silence fell so heavy I could feel it pressing against my skin. Even the insects seemed to pause. Briggs blinked. "What did you say?" I saw realization dawn in his eyes. The whip lowered slightly, replaced by something colder calculation. "Sister to the missus," he repeated, voice low and dangerous. "That right?" Patience's shoulders stiffened. "She don't know what she's saying," she tried again, but Briggs was already grabbing my arm. His fingers dug deep enough to bruise. "We'll see what the lady of the house has to say about that," he growled. "Come on." He dragged me across the field, the others staring in silent horror. Some looked away, afraid to be caught in my madness. Others watched with pity that cut worse than contempt. I stumbled through the rows, my body weak but my mind blazing. I knew what I had done. I had broken the rule that protected us all, the rule of silence. Catherine was in the parlor when we arrived, the same parlor where my laughter had ruined her before. She looked up, startled, needle poised mid-stitch. "What is the meaning of this?" Briggs shoved me forward. "This woman says she's your sister," he said, his voice heavy with accusation. "Claims her name's Elellanena Whitmore. Thought you might want to clear that up." The silence stretched long, enough for the air to tremble. Catherine's face went pale, her lips parting just slightly. I could almost see the thoughts racing behind her eyes, the risk, the shame, the ruin. "She is mad," she said finally, her tone smooth and deadly. "Completely delusional. I hired her out of charity. She's a poor white woman with fancies about fine families. It's part of her affliction." The words struck like a physical blow. My knees buckled, but Briggs's grip kept me upright. "Catherine," I whispered, "please, don't." She wouldn't look at me. "Take her back to the quarters," she said. "If she causes any more disruption, treat her as you would any other troublemaker." "Yes, ma'am," Briggs said, almost smiling. He dragged me outside again. My legs barely worked, but somehow I stayed on my feet. Each step drove her betrayal deeper into me. By the time we reached the edge of the grove, something inside me had shattered completely. When he threw me down in the dirt outside the cabin, I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I only watched his boots retreat through the dust until they vanished. That night, I sat in the corner, back against the wall, shaking. The others didn't ask what happened, they already knew. Mercy pressed a damp cloth to the bruises on my arms. Grace sat beside me in silence, her hand resting on her belly, where her child shifted beneath her skin. Patience finally spoke, her voice soft but unflinching. "We heard what you said out there," she murmured. "About being her sister. It's true, ain't it?" I nodded slowly. "She threw me away," I whispered. "Because I embarrassed her. Because I see things she doesn't want seen." Patience met my eyes. "Then you know now what we always knew, that to folks like her, we ain't people. We're problems to hide." I wanted to argue, to defend some remnant of my sister's humanity, but I couldn't. "I'm still white," I said weakly, as if that meant anything anymore. Mercy shook her head. She corrected. "You was white. Now you ours. Thrown away same as us. And once they throw you away, color don't matter much." Her words settled over the cabin like scripture. I looked around at their faces, Mercy's weary eyes, Grace's quiet courage, Patience's steady strength, and I understood what she meant. That night, we didn't sing. The usual hum of prayer and sorrow was replaced by silence so thick it felt alive. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind slip through the cracks. My body ached, but the deeper pain was sharper, like something inside me had been scraped clean. When I finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Patience's reply came after a long pause. "Not pity," she said. "Truth. You can read. You can write. You've been on both sides. That's power. And power's a dangerous gift if it stays buried." She leaned forward, eyes catching the faint glow of the dying fire. "You could help us. You could make them pay." The words ignited something I hadn't felt since my exile purpose. In the dark, I made a vow not of revenge, but of reckoning. Catherine had buried me among those she called property. From the dirt she buried me in, I would grow the roots of her ruin. Once the decision settled in the cabin like dust, action had to follow. Purpose is the antidote to despair. Without it, sorrow is only a stone you hold until your fingers go numb. Patience, Mercy, and Grace did not offer platitudes. They offered tasks small at first, then larger once they saw I had a mind that could hold not only grief, but also strategy. "Watch," Patience said, folding a scrap of cloth like a map. "Do what you've been doing at night on purpose. Learn the hours that mean something. Watch how they walk, what door they shut. Men with debts are sloppy. They think worry makes them careful, but it makes them loud." I listened. I watched. I learned to walk the plantation at odd hours and to hide in plain sight inside the guise of my fits. My madness was a key that turned without suspicion. When I wandered the grounds in the bright season, folks pitied and let me pass. When I knelt in the dirt at night and pretended to cry, their cruelty felt satisfied and they left me to it. That slack allowed me to move. First, I needed paper. Ledgers and letters are the skeleton of any house of coin. Richard thought his numbers secret because they were written in his hand and kept in his desk. He did not imagine a woman he'd declared mad could be patient enough to copy his scrawl. He did not know how fond he had become of habit. It is surprising how often a man's routine is his own security's loophole. When the house was asleep and the lamps guttered low, I would slip to the library with an empty pail or a pretext for a walk. The maids thought me odd enough to pass without worry. The butler, Samuel, had been kind in small, watchful ways. He looked away when I lingered near the study. I learned the weight of his loyalty. It was to order, not to cruelty, and that small difference kept his eyes from interrogating mine. I began to borrow paper. A sheet here, a scrap there. After a week, I had a small stack hidden beneath a loose board in the cabin. Then I practiced copying. The curves of Richard's R, the way he crossed his T's like a small bridge. I learned to mimic the ink's slant. It is one thing to read a man's ledger. It is another to make his pen do what your plan demands. In those stolen hours I found the outlines of his ruin. Creditors' names repeated like a litany. Ames, Carver, Hargrove. Sums owed in handwriting that trembled where the man who signed was afraid. There were letters, quiet requests for delay, apologies folded like petitions, and in a slip of paper tucked in the back of a drawer, the worst, a list of slaves to be sold if more funds were not forthcoming. Names were a knife inside my ribs. I read, Patience Johnson, Mercy Williams, Grace Thompson. My hand tightened on the paper until the letters blurred. I might have burned the papers in a tremor of mercy, but mercy is not always the weapon that wins freedom. Sometimes mercy must be an instrument of calculation. If I could show the right people the right pages at the right moment, shame and law would do more than a sermon ever could. Shame for a Beaumont was a blade more precise than any physical lash. Next came the forgeries. Old habits of education are a thief's friend. I had learned Samuel's careful script when I helped reconcile accounts, and I practiced until my imitation could pass a casual eye. Then I began to write letters, an anonymous note here, a carefully worded warning there, designed not for the law at first, but for the social ledger of Charleston. A whispered scandal can drown a plantation's credit faster than a bad harvest. People in cloth and coin pay attention to their neighbors' opinions. It was a currency I could spend. Timing mattered. I sent the first anonymous note to a creditor, a neat line about a Beaumont mortgage, misstatements that read plausible to a man who already suspected trouble. I mailed it through a servant's route, a folded scrap tucked into a basket of linens bound for town, and watched the small chaos unfurl. Then I sent a letter with another hand, a rougher, more urgent tone hinting at Richard's secret with Sarah, the house slave, an insinuation that hinted at scandal and disgrace. Men like Richard had fewer defenders for moral folly than for financial folly. All the while, I taught. The letters I penned were also lessons. By candlelight, I traced maps in the dirt for the ones who would go north someday. I taught them to fold a paper into a note, to hide a coin in the seam of a dress. Patience learned to read faster than I expected. Mercy's hands remembered paths on maps like they once remembered herbs. Grace's laughter when she spelled north wrong was small gospel to me, proof that learning could become a rumbling engine we might one day ride. We also forged passes. The Underground Railroad had methods and people we would never have managed without outside help, but a forged pass, said to be a servant on legal business, traveling with a master, could carry a dozen souls through a checkpoint if the handwriting and the seal looked correct. I practiced Cyrus's neat curls and Hartwell's blunt capitals until my hand ached. A pass needed the right scent to smoke and leather, and it had to be folded like every other piece of commerce. Little things like that make a document believable. We chose the ones who could go carefully. Elders and children present a liability on the road. The plan was to gather 12 strong enough to travel, swift enough to hide when a patrol drew near. Patience argued for mercy and grace without hesitating. I argued for a few others, minds keen for navigation, bodies fit for distance. I did not ask for consensus. I argued the math. We had one shot that winter because creditors came quick, and because a plantation cut adrift in its debts draws predators. There was theft too. Small sums at first, pocket change from a drawer, a ring pried from a washstand. I took only what I needed and no more. Each coin had a purpose: food, bribes, a seamstress in Charleston who owed favors. I traded a brooch for information one night. The woman who took it did not know. She gave away the route a carriage would take out of town. A slip of silver purchased trust in pieces. And always the risk: a misplaced scrap, a suspicious glance, a boot that lingered near the yard. I learned to read suspicion like smoke, see which way it was drifting and move upstream. When an overseer changed his gait, or when a courier's visits became too frequent, I shifted plans. Plans that are too rigid break against daily cruelty. Flexibility is survival. By late autumn, the hollow where I kept the papers was full. I had maps, lists, forged passes, and a ledger of who would go and when. The plan was no longer a dream, it was a machine with teeth. It chimed and clicked at night as we tested routes by walking under moonlight and listening to the air for patrols. We practiced folding passes so their creases matched other papers. We rehearsed departures. Doubt was a companion. Fear walked with us, steady and biting. But so did resolve. Patience would look at me sometimes and say nothing. Her silence was not approval or disapproval. It was counting. She counted what we could carry, what we must leave. Mercy sewed pouches under shirts. Grace learned the names of safe houses from a smuggler passing through who owed a favor to a cousin of a cousin. My part was to keep the ledger of plans coherent and to keep the noise low. We had become conspirators and midwives of escape, deliberate and careful. The plantation had given me the key and the room to turn it. They had also given me faces to fight for. In the cabin's low light, among the scratch of needle and the whisper of a lesson, the plan sharpened until its edges shone. When at last I folded the last pass and put it in the loose board, I felt the weight of a future move from possibility to imminence. The machine was wound. All that remained was the hand that would set it in motion. The winter of 1858 came down on Beaumont like judgment. The air itself felt thinner, brittle with expectation. Each day began under a sky that looked carved from iron, and each night ended with the plantation sighing in its sleep timbers, groaning, dogs restless, horses snorting at ghosts only they could sense. But the ghosts were real. They were the spirits of consequence, and they had finally found their way home. By then, our plan was ready. 12 souls had pledged themselves to the road north. 12 names whispered in the dark. Patience, Mercy, Grace, Samuel the butler, Jonah the blacksmith, Ruth and her son Caleb, Leah the seamstress, Isaiah the field hand, and 3 men from a neighboring plantation whose faces I would come to know only by their courage. I kept their names written once, then burned the page to ash. Memory was safer than paper. Each evening, while Catherine dined under crystal light, we met by the dying fire to rehearse our departure. Patience oversaw supplies. Mercy prepared salves and dried herbs for wounds. Grace, her child nearly due, would not come with us not yet, but she worked the longest hours mending clothing and sewing food into hems. The others listened as I repeated our directions, tracing rivers in the dirt with a charred stick. "Follow the watery north," I whispered. "Keep the river to your right until the hills rise. There's a Quaker farm beyond the pine line. They'll hide you." Hope and fear share a heartbeat. I could feel both pounding through the quarters like drums before battle. But the Beaumont's ruin was already unfolding above us, as if Providence had decided to clear our path. One morning the creditors came, 4 men on horseback, their coats lined with frost, their faces set in the impersonal calm of those who count loss for a living. They rode past the quarters without a glance and dismounted at the house. By midday, shouts echoed through the halls, and Richard's voice rose loud enough to rattle the glass. The plantation's secrets were bleeding into the open. The ledgers I had copied and quietly sent had found their mark. That night, Catherine's composure cracked for the first time. She appeared in the doorway of the quarters, a pale ghost haloed in lamplight, the hem of her gown dragging through mud. "Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling between fury and fear, "what have you done?" I stood. The others stilled around me. "I've told the truth," I said simply. "The truth?" she hissed. "You've destroyed us. They're demanding as payments we can't meet. The estate, the crops, everything is on the brink." "You mean your comfort is," I said. "The house will stand. The people you call property will still wake tomorrow, still breathe, still bleed. Perhaps it's your turn to labor, Catherine." Her hand flew up before she realized it. The slap landed light but final. "You've lost your mind," she whispered. "No," I said. "You hid it among the people you enslaved, and I found it again here." Behind me, Patience rose, shoulders squared. "Miss Catherine," she said evenly, "you best leave now." For the first time, my sister looked afraid of the dark. She turned, the lamp shaking in her hand, and fled toward the house. The next day brought word from Charleston. Beaumont was to be auctioned. Land, stock, and slaves all scheduled for sale within a month. It was the very ruin we had prayed for, though it came shrouded in danger. Desperation makes men crueler than hunger. Briggs stalked the fields like a beast sensing fire. Whispers of escape had reached his ears, though not yet their source. He struck harder, shouted louder. Each lash across another's back felt like it landed on my resolve. But fear also worked in our favor. Richard's attention was swallowed by his creditors, Catherine's by her humiliation. They no longer looked at the quarters closely. Their world was imploding too fast. Then came the night of confrontation. I had been sent to the house to return borrowed linens a pretense. Catherine met me in the corridor, her gown undone, her face drawn. "You think you're saving them," she said quietly, "but you're only condemning them. They will be caught. They will be whipped or hanged, and you will have their deaths on your conscience." I met her eyes, the same blue as mine once were, before cruelty clouded them. Better to die reaching for freedom than to live pretending slavery is grace. She shook her head slowly. "You sound just like Mother when the fever took her." Raving. Her voice softened to a whisper. I do love you, Eleanor, but I will not let you ruin everything. It's already ruined, I said. You're just the last to admit it. When I left, I knew I would never see her again. The night before the auction, the air hung heavy with storm. We gathered in silence, each of us holding the weight of what was to come. The 12 knelt together as Mercy prayed in a whisper, Lord, if you can't make the road smooth, make our feet sure. Then we moved. We slipped past the cabins in pairs, keeping to the shadows. The moon hid behind clouds as if aiding our deceit. I carried the last of the forged passes close to my heart. The first gate opened with a soft click. The overseer's spare key had been traded weeks ago for a bottle of whiskey. Beyond that, the fields spread wide and dark. The same fields that had stolen years, now returning them one by one. Patience led the first group, whispering directions. Ruth and Caleb followed. Jonah and Isaiah carried sacks of cornmeal and flint. Leah brought a small jar of honey for her son's cough. Every step forward was a defiance of generations. Every breath was a prayer stitched to a heartbeat. At the second gate, we froze dogs barking in the distance. A lantern flickered near the stables. My throat closed around panic. Then, from the darkness behind us, Grace appeared, her hand resting on her belly. They're turning the dogs toward the barn, she whispered. You got minutes, maybe less. Go. Her eyes shone like firelight in the rain. You come back for me here when it's time. I wanted to promise I would, but words are cheap on nights like that. I touched her hand, nodded once, and we moved on. By dawn, the river lay ahead, a grey ribbon, catching the first weak light. The current whispered freedom's name. I watched as the 12 crossed one by one into the mist. Some would make it north, others might not. History forgets the details of flight, but remembers its direction. When the last shadow vanished among the reeds, I felt both triumph and loss so immense it hollowed me out. I turned back toward Beaumont. I couldn't run. Not yet. I was the noise they would follow, the decoy that would draw the searchlight. If I disappeared too, suspicion would spread north before they had a day's head start. I walked back into the jaws of the plantation, alone. By noon, the storm broke. Rain hammered the fields as men with rifles discovered the empty cabins. Briggs's shouts split the air. He found me sitting on the porch of the big house, soaked, calm. They're gone, he spat. Where are they? I looked at him, rain running down my face like tears I no longer had. Everywhere, I said, and nowhere you'll ever find. He struck me then once, twice, but pain had become just another sound in the chorus of the living. Behind him, Catherine watched from the doorway, her face unreadable. By sunset, I was chained for sale, my name recorded among the human debts of Beaumont. They thought they were punishing me. They didn't know they were granting me freedom's final apprenticeship. As the wagon carried me away, I looked back once. Smoke from the house curled into the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon, 12 souls walked toward light, and Catherine, my sister, stood on her ruined veranda, watching everything she had built rot under the weight of truth. When the wagon rolled away from Beaumont Plantation, I did not look back again. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of ash and wet cotton, a mingling of ruin and rebirth. My wrists burned from the irons, yet beneath the ache, I felt a strange calm, a clarity that comes when a long nightmare finally ends. The house of Beaumont was collapsing behind me, its wealth stripped away, its mistress haunted by a truth she could not bury. I had done what I set out to do. I had turned their cruelty into their undoing. The wagon jolted over ruts as we traveled north toward Virginia. The man driving it, Thomas Hartwell, my new owner, spoke little. He was older than Richard Beaumont, his face marked not by vice but by weariness. When he glanced at me, it wasn't lust or hatred I saw, but curiosity tinged with pity. Perhaps he'd heard rumors about the mad white woman sold cheap from a bankrupt estate. To him, I was an oddity, a curiosity purchased for household work or tutoring. To me, he was just another link in a chain I meant to break. Hartwell's plantation lay along the James River, a smaller estate, quieter, less cruel on the surface. But slavery wears many masks. The men and women who labored there still carried the same haunted stoop, the same resignation I had seen in South Carolina. Only the tempo of suffering changed. Collins, the overseer, was strict but not sadistic, which in that world passed for mercy. Still, it was bondage all the same. The fields did not care who cracked the whip or how softly he spoke. Hartwell assigned me to the main house, where I was to assist with domestic management. It meant teaching the housemaids to read inventories, recording expenses, and occasionally tutoring his young nephew when he visited from Richmond. The work was mild compared to the cotton fields, but my heart missed the hum of the quarters, the unity, the defiance that had shaped me. Now I moved between two worlds, accepted by neither. The whites viewed me as a fallen creature, pitiable but suspect. The enslaved eyed me with guarded curiosity, uncertain whether I was one of them or something else entirely. Isolation, however, breeds invention. I used the quiet to listen, to watch and to plan. Within weeks, I mapped the routines of the Hartwell estate, the patrol routes, the storage rooms, the key hooks behind the pantry door. I watched which letters the master sealed in haste, which he left open upon his desk. And I began again, carefully, deliberately, to build new lines of connection. The Underground Railroad, I discovered, had veins that reached even here. Richmond was a city of contradictions, slave markets by day, abolition whispers by night. Through coded exchanges disguised as recipe notes or trade invoices, I reconnected with the network I had once helped from afar. My madness was still my shield. The guards dismissed my mutterings as lunacy when I spoke of stars and rivers and roads leading north. They did not know I was reciting escape routes. Months passed. Letters began to arrive from the north, each one folded into an innocent delivery, a bolt of fabric, a parcel of dried herbs, a book borrowed and returned. They were from Patience. Her handwriting, once hesitant, now flowed with steady confidence. Philadelphia, February 1859. Eleanor, we are safe. The baby is strong, and Mercy tends to the sick in our community. Grace named her daughter after you. She says the child will walk free and learn to read before she can even talk. We remember you each Sunday. We are saving money to help others follow. Do not lose faith, sister. I read that letter until the paper softened with wear. My heart swelled with pride and longing, but also with renewed purpose. The work was not finished. As long as one chain remained unbroken, none of us were free. In February 1859, Virginia trembled with unease. Rumors of rebellion had spread after John Brown's bold strike in Harper's Ferry. Planters whispered of conspiracies, of white agitators stirring the enslaved to rise. Soldiers patrolled the roads. Fear, as always, was both weapon and wound. That fear gave me my moment. Over months, I had gathered the names of those on the Hartwell plantation who longed for escaped men and women whose strength and resolve mirrored those 12 souls from Beaumont. I studied maps, marked rivers, memorized trails north through Maryland. I wrote to my contacts, secured safe houses, and prepared forged passes sealed with wax stolen from Hartwell's desk. We would leave under cover of confusion, using the chaos of the militia's mobilization as our cloak. When the night came, the moon was a thin silver coin behind clouds. 23 people gathered in the shadows of the tobacco sheds, hearts pounding like drums. Daniel, a young man with eyes bright as polished brass, stood at the front. "You sure about this, Miss Eleanor?" he asked. "You don't owe us nothing." "I owe you everything," I said. "I owe you the world I helped build. I owe you its undoing." We left before dawn. I watched them vanish into the dark woods, my instructions burned into their memory. Follow the river. The first safe house is 5 miles east of the ferry road. Don't stop until you hear church bells. I stayed behind once more, ready to face the storm. 3 days later, the alarm bells rang. 23 gone. Posters went up offering bounties. The countryside erupted in panic. They came for me before sunrise, armed men, faces hard with accusation. They found papers hidden in my mattress, maps, symbols, coded notes. They dragged me to the county jail, shouting words like traitor and abolitionist. I was charged with conspiracy to incite slave rebellion, a crime that could hang a person, white or black alike. The trial was a spectacle. The courthouse packed with planters and their wives, eager to see the mad woman of Beaumont condemned. I stood in the dock, chains on my wrists, and when the judge asked if I denied the charge, I lifted my head and spoke with the calm of conviction. "I do not deny it," I said. "I helped human beings claim their freedom. If that is rebellion, then let rebellion stand holy in the eyes of God. I was born into sin not of my choosing, and I chose to repent through justice. You call me mad, because I saw humanity where you saw property. Then madness is the only sanity left in this country." The room fell silent. The judge, pale and sweating, sentenced me to imprisonment. He could not bring himself to order a hanging, for even in the South, a white woman's death for conscience still unsettled the public. But he made it clear my life as I had known it was over. Prison was cold and dim. I was given a small cell with a cot, a Bible, and an old quill. They meant the Bible as comfort, but the quill was the true mercy. I wrote pages upon pages everything I had seen and known. I wrote the names of the enslaved who had vanished into freedom, the details of cruelty no history book would keep, the truths that polite society refused to face. When the Union Army began its march through the South in 1864, my sentence ended not with pardon but with chaos. Guards fled, gates were left open. I walked out into a world breaking apart. I went north to Washington, where hospitals overflowed with men torn by war. There I found a new purpose, nursing the wounded, binding the limbs of soldiers, black and white alike, who fought to end the evil I had spent my life defying. The war ended in 1865. The streets of Washington filled with freedmen dancing and crying under the rising Sunday. I watched them, my heart too full to speak. The cause had outlived me, as it was meant to. Typhoid took me that autumn. I was 33. My last sight was of Patience, Mercy, and Grace standing beside my bed, their voices weaving an old hymn of freedom as the world dimmed. They said I was buried in Arlington beneath a simple marker, E. Whitmore, abolitionist, 1832, 1865. Catherine died 5 years later in poverty, her name unspoken in Charleston parlors. Of the 12 from Beaumont, all reached freedom. Patience built a school. Mercy healed the sick. Grace raised 5 children, all born free. As for me, my body sleeps, but my story walks still in every whisper of defiance, every act of love that refuses fear. For madness may have sent me among the slaves, but justice kept me there. And if my name fades into dust, let it be carried on the wind with theirs, bound forever in the only kind of family that cannot be broken, those who chose freedom over silence.